Hello. Today I'm really excited to post an introduction to Dallas Willard. Not long ago I finished up an 18-month cohort program where I got to be immersed in his books and learn from people who knew him very well. So I've been inspired. Most people will know Willard as the writer of books for a Christian audience, chiefly The Divine Conspiracy, published in 1989. He was also professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California for 47 years, an ordained pastor, a much sought-after speaker, and is now becoming more and more celebrated as a theologian and reformer. I want to give you some backdrop to his earlier life, focusing on the time before he started writing all his books. I'll also touch on some of the things that shaped him as a philosopher, and I'm very much in debt to this book, Becoming Dallas Willard by Gary Moon. Willard was born in 1935 in Buffalo, Missouri, and died in 2013 in Los Angeles of pancreatic cancer. His father, Albert Alexander Willard, was a farmer and store owner. His mother, Mamie Joyce Lindesmith, had been a school teacher with a great fondness for writing. She wrote poems and essays for the local newspaper, and she loved to write letters. Dallas was the youngest of 4 children. Dallas Willard had a hard beginning. Listen to some of the things that he endured as a child. His family was so poor that his mother was not happy to have a 4th child. She was a compassionate woman. She felt terrible guilt for her feelings, but eventually this was communicated to Dallas, and he grew up with the knowledge of that. One day, when Dallas was still a baby, Mamie fell off a haystack and she developed a serious hernia. This was something that needed to be surgically addressed. There was a hospital where this could have been done, about 30 miles away, but Albert had an insurance policy with a hospital further away in Topeka, and being so poor, he opted to take that route. Leaving the children with Mamie's mother, Albert and Mamie took the long journey, 218 miles, and by the time they got to Topeka, Mamie had developed a serious fever, and a few weeks later she died. Dallas was 2 years old at the time. At the funeral, he tried to climb into the coffin to be with her. For many years, Dallas and his siblings were moved around among different sets of relatives. At one point, Albert remarried so that the children could have a mother figure. But this new mom was not keen on having children around, particularly little Dallas, it is said. So they got farmed out again. I feel like the worst part of this story is that the new mom wanted to get rid of everything that belonged to Mamie, so she got rid of all the writing that was in the house. So Dallas could only know her writing through what she had published in the newspaper, or we could presume letters that she had written to his siblings, but she had not yet written any to him. Dallas would spend the longest span of time with his older brother, J.I., and his wife, Bertha. Bertha was only 18 when Dallas moved in. She said later, "I was so young at the time that Dallas and I had to raise each other." But that was a restorative time in that home, and throughout his extended family, there were many who demonstrated to him Christian love and taught him the message of the gospel. When he was 9 years old, Dallas went forward at an altar call and gave his heart to Jesus Christ. He said later that he felt Jesus was the greatest person ever to have lived, and he wanted to be on his side. Dallas went to grade school with his brothers and sister in a one-room schoolhouse. The high school was just a little bigger, with a graduating class of 10. He was a popular boy, known to be smart, but confesses to have been rough around the edges and to have had some unsavory habits. After high school, Dallas worked in Nebraska, Idaho, and Colorado as a migrant farm worker and roofer. At the same time, he began a very serious read of Plato's Republic. He is reported to already have read every book in his high school library. In 1956, Dallas was encouraged to go to college at Tennessee Temple University. Tennessee Temple was a newly established, very conservative Southern Baptist school. Lots of speakers came in from all around, revivalists, orators, preachers, and they also gave Dallas a lot to think about. A few really significant things happened during this time at Tennessee Temple. The first was a scenario in the college laundry room. Dallas had a long holiday weekend with a whole day to spend with only his laundry and his King James Bible. He found himself reading through the entire Gospel of John all at once and hearing it in a completely new way. He said later that he discovered himself immersed in something that was much bigger and deeper than he had supposed. and his expectations of what the Christian life was began to change. From that point on, he settled into a pattern of seeking out that kind of immersion. He would go up into a Sunday school room in a nearby church and drink in the scripture and the solitude, and he would pray. He also found a book called Deeper Experiences of Famous Christians by James Gilchrist Lawson. This was the beginning of his exposure to Christian testimony throughout the ages. He met people in this book who had sought and found that same deep immersion that he had found in the laundry room and the Sunday school room. He also realized that his own tradition was not the only one available to him. Now here's another pivotal scenario. Dallas had gotten an F in a class on Romans, so he wasn't always excelling at this point academically. He had to retake the final exam under some kind of particularly intense pressure, and he cheated on the exam. This cheating precipitated a few days of confession and prayer that he looked back on later as another turning point in his life. A visiting preacher named Robert Roger Brown had reached out to him at an evening prayer meeting that week, put his hand on his shoulder, and prayed for him. And Dallas was deeply affected, saying later, he went into a kind of fog in which God became very near. And he said this sense of nearness never disappeared for the rest of his life. Also during this time at Tennessee Temple, Dallas met Jane Lakes, whom he married while they were still students in 1935. Jane had been a bit bemused at first by his philosophical meanderings, but she was won over when he began to write poetry for her and take her out for ice cream. They got involved in student-led evangelistic activities where Jane would play the pump organ and Dallas would preach or sing. Dallas had really taken to preaching at this time when he was given a chance. He said that he was a real whiz-bang kind of preacher. He said, "I thought you had to preach by setting people's hair on fire." But Jane reports that he was nonetheless genuine and full of heart. Dallas finished at Tennessee Temple with a bachelor's in psychology. After graduation, he and Jane went back to his home turf in Missouri, where they both taught high school. Jane taught English and music, and Dallas taught math. He also preached during this time and was ordained in the Southern Baptist Church. That same year, they had their first child, John, and then at the end of the year, there was a big surprise when the high school administrators learned that the school they had just graduated from was not fully accredited. So Dallas and Jane were going to have to start all over again in order to get real teaching certificates. Now they go to Baylor University in Waco, Texas, for 18 months. Dallas studied philosophy and religion, while Jane studied music education. It was at Baylor that Dallas discovered philosophy as an academic pursuit. His horizons were significantly broadened, and Gary Moon does a wonderful job of breaking down and describing the specific kinds of influence that his professors had on him. Looking back, Dallas remarked, "In conservative Baptist circles, there is a big issue about the relationship of faith and reason usually loses out. I really learned to love and trust thought while I was at Baylor. It helped me in ways I did not understand at the time, helped me appreciate the goodness and power of thought, which was not the least bit emphasized among the Baptists I knew. I think that has gotten a little better, but it is still the basis of many conflicts when you consider the role of thought in interpreting the Bible." After graduation, the Willards moved to Macon, Georgia, which was Jane's hometown. Dallas taught literature at a high school and also was associate pastor and choir director at a Baptist church. And he says some very interesting things about this time. He says he knew very little about the things he was preaching. To quote him again, he says, "I was totally incapable of making any sense of God and the human soul. I was very sincere, and people regarded me as effective and all of that. But when I looked at my congregation, I saw them struggling and not able to deal with issues that constantly defeated them, and many of them would give up and just hang on and be faithful church members." He goes on to say he was so ignorant that he felt himself a danger in the pulpit. So he wanted to go back to school again, hoping to improve his understanding of the soul. Now, at this time, he had no intention of actually getting a degree. In the summer of 1959, Dallas took his family to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he would study philosophy. Now, I need to describe here a very important juncture. Right about this time, inside academic philosophy, there were two trends of thought that diverged. One of them was called idealism, the other realism. The first, idealism, is the view that associates reality to ideas in the mind rather than to material objects. So, is there a hand really there? Idealism says, no, what you see is just represented by the mechanisms of your mind. The second view is called realism. Realism views that things exist independently of the mechanisms of our mind. They're there whether or not we are thinking about them or the way we perceive them. So we see a hand, we can trust that there really is a hand there. You can imagine why Willard would prefer that approach, because for him, philosophy was a very practical undertaking. He wanted to understand human beings, and in particularly how human beings relate to what is beyond them. So it was as a realist that Willard anchored his thought, even though that made him eventually a minority among his peers. Another problem of idealism is that it embraced what Moon calls the naturalistic methods of analytical philosophy. Within analytical philosophy, there is no reality beyond what is seen. And for Dallas, as for the classical philosophers, Plato and Socrates, reality began beyond what is material. It begins in the invisible. At the University of Wisconsin, Dallas had professors who encouraged him in this route as a realist. Most significantly, he was introduced to the work of Edmund Husserl. Now, just a side note, Husserl was a key figure in the thinking of John Paul II, and so I put a link below for those interested in that. Eventually, Willard would become an expert on Husserl himself. He translated many of his writings into English for the first time, and he wrote his own book about him in 1984. Edmund Husserl was the founder of the school of phenomenology. Now, I'll read you the clearest definition I could find. The primary objective, I read, of phenomenology is the direct investigation and description of phenomena as consciously experienced, without theories about their causal explanation, and as free as possible from unexamined preconceptions and presuppositions. I don't understand exactly what Dallas did with Husserl in his academic work, but Moon, our good friend in this, says it was Husserl who worked out for him the details of what must be true about the human mind in order for it to have confidence in knowing what is real, so that we can say, yes, the hand is there. So neither realism nor phenomenology in themselves do anything like prove the existence of God or suggest that the Christian worldview is what reality is. But they will both accommodate and help Willard as his intellectual quest about the nature of reality and the nature of knowing is merging with his own personal experience of Jesus Christ as a living person, and his study of the Scriptures. Another thing that washes out of Husserl's influence is Dallas's own confidence in what knowledge is. Dallas does a whole lot with knowledge and knowing, and he will explain different kinds of knowledge. For example, he emphasizes the particular knowing that is meant and illustrated in the Scriptures as we look at the lives of Abraham and Moses and other key figures. That is to say that that kind of knowing consists of direct contact with God, personal, intimate, experiential exchange. Also, he will emphasize the distinction between having real spiritual knowledge of the triune God and merely professing belief in him. Yet another way is that he will talk about the teachings of Jesus, specifically the Sermon on the Mount, as being a source of moral knowledge, which is to say that it's a discoverable, learnable body of knowledge that can be put to the test according to its purpose. So he would compare this to the specific body of knowledge that a dentist or a mechanic would have about teeth or cars. It's knowledge that is very specific, can be learned, and is testable. Back to life in Madison, Wisconsin. Things started off very hard. Dallas experienced some severe anxiety. Presumably, he felt he just couldn't measure up. But another source of anxiety we know was the question of whether he should be studying philosophy at all. It could be that others expressed to him that his interest in philosophy was in conflict with his love for Christ. He said later, "As I prayed and worked through that with others and with myself, the Lord said to me on one occasion, quote, 'You know, If you can find a better way, Jesus would be the first person to tell you to take it." Unquote. Now that may be a shocking thought to you. I'm still quoting Dallas here. But to me, it was very liberating, and it helped me be open to look at anything and realize I did not have to live ducking and dodging and saying, "Oh, we don't think about that." After this was resolved in himself, he really began to shine. He was awarded a prestigious fellowship, he'd gained the esteem of his professors and peers, and eventually he gained confidence that his philosophical pursuits within academia were intersecting with his pursuit of God. They were feeding his understanding about the spiritual life. Another way of describing this juncture could be to say that he'd come to believe that none of the needs of humans that had inspired philosophical questioning to begin with fall outside of the needs that Christ himself meets by offering us his life. Neither do they fall outside of what Christ addresses with his own words and teachings. I hope that I say that right and that it's clear, because it really is an important thing to understand about Dallas Willard. Now to some of the other things that are happening in the background. Daughter Becky joined the family in 1962, and in his final year at UW, Dallas was back to pastoring a church again. He was very much at home as an academic and as a pastor, and he loved doing both. So now he had to decide which he was going to pursue as his actual vocation. He finally made up his mind when a friend said to him, "Dallas, if you go to the churches, the university will be closed to you. But if you go to the university, the church will be open to you." Meaning something like, if he's vocationally anchored in the church, then people in academia are not going to notice or take his thought very seriously. But if he's anchored vocationally in academia, then people in the church will hear him, and he'll have their ear. And that's what happened. We can look back and say, yes, he was right. He had our ear. You may wonder, how could someone who was so anchored in his Christian outlook manage in postmodern academia? And did his peers take him seriously? Surely not all of them did, but he pulled this off really well. He was very much beloved and valued as a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, and he had profound influence on many, many of the people around him. I have a link below to the obituary that USC published just after Willard died, and it's a beautiful tribute. Now just a few more goodies about Dallas. Dallas loved music. He had an operatic kind of voice. He and Jane and their children all were musical. They loved art as well. They had a small hobby farm situation outside of Los Angeles for all those years. Lots of animals. He loved to work with his hands. He built all kinds of little buildings around the property. He was a beekeeper. Famously, he met Richard Foster at a little Quaker church early on in 1970. He became Foster's very close friend and mentor, and he was a founding member of the team that started the Renovari movement. And I've put a link down beneath so that you can see what that's all about. Dallas Willard's life continued not to be an easy one. There was lots of hardship and some tragedy, and I hope that you'll read the rest of his story in the Gary Moon book. It's a beautiful book. It's written in gratitude and love, and I'm sure that it's not the only book that's going to be written about Dallas Willard. I'm going to post another video soon where I discuss some of the main coordinates in Dallas's thinking. I'm also getting ready to read from Sabina Wurmbrand. I hope, meanwhile, that you'll click on the like and the subscribe, perhaps leave a comment so that my channel can get a little more circulation. Thank you.